Your plane is flying at cruising altitude. All four engines are working perfectly, right? And then one of the engines fails, right? Like the regulations actually mean that you can't do it the way you want. So do you, to your point, Chris, do you just say, oh, well, I guess we're all dead and crash into the side of a mountain, right? Like completely redesign your experience, just throw out all of your thinking and just do what the regulations say? Or do you say, well, okay, we've got one fewer engine. We might need to reroute to a different airport. We're going to slow down a bit, but we're still heading in the direction we want to be going. We're still going to stay alive. We're not going to throw out our vision. We're just going to adapt our vision in as user-centric and as business-centric, right? In the sense of what is my vision and how do I make sure to keep as close to it as possible? And we do that repeatedly until we have something that's viable.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein. In today's episode, we're going to talk about how to make sure that your company doesn't blow up, that your startup doesn't drift away from its vision as soon as it's hit by the real world. One thing that we can guarantee you on your startup journey is that things will not go to plan. So how do you make sure that you end up building the sort of company that you want to build? In this episode, we're going to cover graceful degradation in your decision-making, the importance of having healthy disrespect for authority and the status quo, and then the nuts and bolts of how to develop your systems and protocols to make sure that you make the sorts of decisions that keep you true to your vision of what you want to build. All that and more coming up. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
Now, before we get started, Yaniv, we want to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact. The Pact says, in return for some of this value that we're giving you, please rate us and review us in your favorite podcasting app, share us on your favorite social network, and spread the word. It helps us grow the show.
And I've got an example from a listener right here. I love it when I get a great review, and this one is the first one that explicitly mentions the Pact. So Honky Tonk Robot says that the Startup Podcast expanded their horizon. Just finished a marathon listen of TSP and upholding my end of the Pact. I've often felt like a startup outsider as a small business owner. The podcast has helped me understand how to attack my startup idea and given me the confidence to go all in on something much bigger in scale than my previous business. This is just so great to hear, Honky Tonk Robot. This is why we do it, and we're so glad that we've been able to help you along on your startup journey.
That's so cool to see, Yaniv. I love getting these reviews, and it helps us grow the show. So do like Honky Tonk Robot. Please spread the word and help us grow the show. All right, Yaniv, let's jump into it. In today's episode, we want to talk about graceful degradation and how it applies to business decisions and product decisions and building incredible companies. But first, let's define what is graceful degradation.
Systems have the right way of working, where everything's working the way it should, and that is the state you want it to be in. But sometimes something goes wrong, and the question is, what happens when that something goes wrong? This can be a bridge or a road or a skyscraper or a computer system piece of software, anything like that. The question is, what happens when things start to go wrong? Does it collapse in a heap? Or does it still mostly keep working? And obviously you want it to mostly keep working, right? If a bridge loses a pylon, does it collapse? If an airplane engine goes out, does the airplane crash or can it keep flying on one engine? Graceful degradation is about the idea that when something goes wrong, you can kind of keep muddling through and the system still mostly works rather than catastrophically collapsing.
That's right, Yaniv. That's a fantastic description of the concept in general about systems. For this episode, what I'd like to do is talk about how you can apply this concept of graceful degradation to your decision-making in your business, in your product strategy, and your implementation details so that you can get the very best outcomes at every stage of the process. This topic is really related to an episode we've done in our back catalog about figuring out the ideal and working backwards. And in that episode, we talked about people often increment their way to nowhere, or they fail to think about what is the ideal outcome for a product or a business or a fundraiser or what have you. And they're kind of flapping around in the wind, or their ideas and decisions are pre-compromised. They assume that the technology team can't do something, or the certain fundraising can't be done a certain way, or a certain business model can't be done. They just give up before they even start. What we argued in that episode was, no, you need to figure out what your ideal is and connect the dots backwards to have a roadmap from here to the ideal. The pushback on that is often, well, that's academic, or that's really hard, or you're never going to hit the ideal, nothing is perfect, and we have to deal with the realities of the real world. And this is where graceful degradation in decision-making comes in. It helps you to be implementing the very best option at every step without being dogmatic or unrealistic as you make those implementation choices. It's about really compromising judiciously, compromising minimally to stay on track with the ideal and to really deliver the most optimal decision and implementation at every step.
To hear you describe it, you say graceful degradation. What I think is at the core of this, Chris, is saying, okay, you start with an ideal. And you don't do that because you think the ideal can be achieved, right? You're not naive. You're not in your ivory tower. You exist in the real world. And then the question is, the real world is going to force you to compromise. How do you compromise in the right way? When the real world comes for your beautiful vision and you need to compromise, how do you compromise without corrupting your vision?
The vocabulary we started to establish on the show is compromise versus corruption. Corruption is like, oh, well, we didn't get the ideal. Let's pivot or let's switch tact entirely. And what judicious compromise suggests, or this concept of graceful degradation, is like, just move down to the next best option. And so what you need to really think about is, what is that stack rank of next best options, and working your way down that list and trying to stay as high up on the list as possible. So let's take this out of the abstract and talk about a concrete example, okay? Very often, you will have a product in hand that is not working, and users don't understand how the user experience, how the user interface works. It's very easy, it's very obvious to want to develop a knowledge base, develop an educational program, develop handheld onboarding experiences where they have to have a demo with your team to understand how the product works. So you build a lot of scaffolding around the product to try to compensate for its weaknesses. Now, if you are in the go-to-market team, you're the customer support team, if you're in the marketing team, those might be the only things you can do to affect the user experience, because you're not in product, you're not in design, you're not engineering. And so the best thing you can do is to go add scaffolding around the product to support it in the market. And that's probably the right thing for you to do. But as a product manager, as a product designer, as an engineer, you should be feeling very, very uncomfortable about that there's so much bubble wrap to compensate for the weaknesses of your product. And you should be thinking about this graceful degradation of user experiences that I'm about to explain. So if the user doesn't get the user experience, the first thing you want to think about is not like, how do we write some documentation? You want to think about, how do we improve the visual metaphor so that it is immediately clear, just by looking at the pattern of the objects on the screen, what is the relationship between those objects? So that you don't have to explain the mental model, the visual metaphor, the relationships between the objects at all. It's entirely intuited by the layout. And so that's your kind of your first priority. You don't want to compensate for the problem by jumping to other different complicated things where you have to explain the interface, where you have to write lots of documentations. Your first best option is fix the visual metaphor so the user doesn't have to read a single line of text on the interface, but they still immediately, intuitively understand the relationship between the objects on the interface. And then if that doesn't work, then maybe you want to adjust what's called the affordances. So what are the buttons and the, let's say, drop shadows and the details that make that visual metaphor clearer, immediately clearer? And if that doesn't work, you want to improve the copy and the word choices and the names of things. So now the user, you see, is not just glanceably easier. Now they're starting to read certain things, and that detail starts to fill in some of the blanks. And if that doesn't work, that's not getting you all the way there, then maybe you're adding one-line explainers in line to the interface so you can explain the meaning of an object or a concept right in line. And you can see there's a series of things, right? So then you can have clear and intuitive empty states. You can have coach marks and first-time walkthroughs. Then you can have video tutorials. And then you can start to think about, hey, let's do inline chat. Let's do a documentation center. Let's do live training programs by people. Instead of doing it in that order, what you find as a designer or a product manager will go, let's add coach marks. Let's give people a guided tour of our interface. And it's like, why is your interface so hard that you must give people a guided tour of it? Your first job is to make the interface so intuitive at a glance that the guided coach marks are not necessary. And you only fall back to the guided coach marks because you've tried all of those other better, more intuitive things first. And so this is just an example as it relates to user interfaces, but this applies to dealing with regulatory constraints, dealing with system uptime, dealing with fundraising, dealing with everything. There is a hierarchy of best options that you want to fall back through in a judicious way.
And again, bring that back to the concept of graceful degradation. You're talking about, in this example, creating a user interface that demonstrates graceful degradation. So remember, graceful degradation happens when something goes wrong. What is the response of the system? In this case, the thing that you are saying is going wrong is a user comes in, they don't quite understand how to use the product. Well, do you have ways for them to get back on track? They don't quite get it, but they'll still get their task done? Or is it the moment that they misunderstand a single thing about your product, they're screwed and they've got to go read the user manual, right? Can you give them that ability to recover from errors and keep going? Or are you just going to abandon them as soon as they step off the happy path? And that's really what it's about.
So I'm actually talking about two kinds of graceful degradation occurring in parallel there. The one I'm actually directly talking about right now is your decision-making about how to make the interface better should be gracefully degrading through those possible tools in your tool belt. The tools being improving the visual metaphor, improving the copy, improving the short line explainers. And your decision-making, the last resort is making a whole bunch of documentation and live training. Now, what you're touching on, Yaniv, is an additional form of graceful degradation, which is that the interface itself should offer you increasing options for support if you still fail to get what's going on, so that if you don't understand it at first glance, you still have access to level 1 support, level 2 support, et cetera, et cetera. So your decision-making about the user interface and the user interface itself should both have a form of graceful degradation built in.
So maybe let's go to another example that doesn't intertwine them as much, because again, it comes down, Chris, to your vision. What you want is a robustness to your vision, which is to say, as you get hit by knocks from the real world, and you're listening to this podcast, you're a founder or you work at a startup, you know the real world is coming for you. Nothing is going to go to plan. So when things don't go to plan, how can you make sure that you're still moving in the direction of your vision rather than being swept wildly off course, right? How can we make sure that we are responding to these knocks in a way that doesn't cause the bridge to collapse, the plane to crash, all of those things?
Here's another example that I think will tell the story really well. So often when you encounter companies that are in highly regulated environments, right? Financial, health, etc., the pushback I'll often get on a product idea is like, oh, Chris, the regulator will never let us do that, so we shouldn't even try, right? That's an example of a failure to degrade gracefully, to degrade from the ideal gracefully. It's like, well, the regulator is going to have something to say about that. Let's avoid that entirely. So you've gone from 100 to 0 in terms of your ambition to execute that product the way you imagine. And so instead, what you want to do is encounter all of the possibilities between 100 and 0 in terms of your idea and implementing that thing. So for example, you start with what is the ideal? What is the ideal, ethical, user-centric approach you want to build? Now, the regulator may not like that. They may have painted a very specific thing they want you to do. But where do you stand in terms of what's the ideal that you believe to be ethical and user-centric, even though it may not be what the regulator wants? And then let's figure out how to get ethically around what the regulator wants. So how do we minimize our exposure to the regulatory regime? Let me give you an example. I was working with a startup where they were giving some financial advice, and they were saying, we have to format it in this way because the regulator has dictated that all advice must come in this kind of PDF style, multi-page advice. And I'm like, what makes you cross the line from information to advice? And they're like, oh, as soon as we say XYZ, as soon as we make a specific recommendation about a specific fund. I'm like, great. Well, then don't make that specific recommendation on the first screen. make it a dashboard where you're giving the key financial health metrics, but don't give the specific advice, now that part of the product is no longer covered under the regime of the regulator, right? And so it's like they were racing to be regulated. They were embracing the regulation and the constraints of the regulation, whereas I helped them understand 90% of this product and 90% of what we're trying to say is outside of the regime of that regulator. So let's carve off the regulated part out of that thing. So that's the first judicious compromise. That may not work for everything, right? So then the next possible compromise might be add some concise disclaimers to carve out or skirt around the regulatory constraint, or adjust words. So instead of saying, here's our advice, you say, here's what most people do, or here's what is common. Instead of it being recommendations, it's options, right? So you can change the word in order to get around the regulatory framework. Again, and I'm talking about ethically here. I'm not saying that you want to screw people. I'm saying if you earnestly believe that this is a better approach, but the regulation is painting you into a corner, how might you adjust that so that you are doing the right thing by the user, but not hamstrung by the regulation? And then finally, in this cascading set of options, go engage with the regulator. Go fight for what you think is ethical and valuable and user-centric. Go make your case so that you can try to change the status quo and disrupt the industry in a positive way. And then finally, and only finally, do you actually make compromises in the product to comply with the regulation that you just couldn't adjust and bend and work around according to your ideal. And so that's where that final thing that most people jump to finally and only comes in at the very end.
I think it's actually a really brilliant example of that way of thinking. And again, what are we talking about here? You have everything going right, which is you've done your user-centric design. You have everything exactly the way that you think it should be in the ideal world. Your plane is flying at cruising altitude. All 4 engines are working perfectly, right? And then one of the engines fails, right? Like the regulations actually mean that you can't do it the way you want. So do you, to your point, Chris, do you just say, oh, well, I guess we're all dead and crash into the side of a mountain, right? Like completely redesign your experience. Just throw out all of your thinking and just do what the regulations say? Or do you say, well, okay, we've got one fewer engine. We might need to reroute to a different airport. We're going to slow down a bit, but we're still heading in the direction we want to be going. We're still going to stay alive. We're not going to throw out our vision. We're just going to adapt our vision in as user-centric and as business-centric, right? In the sense of what is my vision and how do I make sure to keep as close to it as possible? And we do that repeatedly until we have something that's viable. And I think that is really at the core of it, right? So how can you be robust? That's actually in the context of graceful degradation. The other word is robust, right? Systems that are robust are systems that degrade gracefully. That's one of the attributes of a robust system. And your vision needs to be robust.
To completely bastardize this plane metaphor,
Let's.
you see people go, I dream of a world where humans can take flight. And if we put 2 engines on 2 wings, they will ascend into the sky. And the regulator is kind of like the guy goes, well, those engines might fail and those people will crash and burn and die. And in fact, before you even get to the regulator, the people inventing the plane go, oh, that engine might fail and people will crash and burn. So we should just give up on that. Let's make a boat.
Yeah.
It's like, because something may go wrong with that engine. Let's give up and go build a boat. What we're saying here is like, how about you design a plane with 4 engines or 2 engines where one could fail. And then if both fail, it can still glide to a landing so that you can still execute your vision of human flight. And then when the regulator goes, well, you're not allowed to do that because we don't like engines around here. It's like, excuse me, here's why engines are great. And here's why flying from, London to New York in 8 hours is a great idea. And it's going to change the world. Let's go change the regulation. It is about invention of human flight, in this case, requires you to push against the laws of physics and to figure out what would happen if there's a catastrophic failure and do it anyway. Let's talk about a more recent example. The regulators for Uber said, you cannot tell contractors how to do the job. By definition, a contractor is someone who does something for you, but you can't be prescriptive about how they do it. And so Uber couldn't have user manuals that say, as an Uber driver, you must do this, this, and this, and you must not do this, this, and this, and you have to wear this uniform, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, Uber would have lost the contractor status for these drivers, which would have broken the business model. And so what did Uber do? Well, plenty in the audience will argue that this was ethical or not ethical. They didn't call them Uber drivers. They called them Uber driver partners. They are partners. So that's just change in vocabulary. You remember in my graceful degradation strategy for regulation, change the word. They're partners, okay? And then they didn't say, here's a user manual for how to be a great Uber driver. They said, 5-star drivers often have bottles of water in their car. Or drivers with bottles of water in the car get more 5-star ratings. That's not an instruction. That is a statistical fact, right? And so they changed the way they framed the communication to help drivers win the game of the real-time dynamic marketplace known as Uber. And so that is a very simple example. And again, many people in the audience may feel negatively the way Uber muscled its way into markets, but that's the way Uber muscled its way into markets. That's the way Uber drove disruption in the status quo. And by the way, the status quo was controlled by mafias and regulatory capture. So I personally have no problems with what Uber did in that case. And so find where there is regulatory capture, find where there is stuff that is actually not helpful and ethical for a user, and help your partner, your product, to communicate clearly without getting entangled in legacy regulation in that example.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business. By vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8, Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal. So Chris, like at this point, it's sort of like a no-brainer. Obviously, no one says, I want to degrade gracelessly. Nobody says, I want my plane to crash. Of course, the question is, how do I instill this within myself, within my organization, so we are robust, so we do degrade gracefully? What are some of your top tips?
At the end of the day, it really does require a little bit of taste and hustle, and it takes a certain kind of mental model and view of the world. But trying to learn this, trying to adapt this, trying to teach this to your company, I think there are some ways of doing that. I think the first is you just got to have a vision. You have to understand what your ideal is. I'm almost obsessed with putting aside the technical constraints, putting aside the regulatory constraints, putting aside the financial macroeconomic constraints, putting aside whatever the constraints are around the decision you're making, and just figure out what's the ideal. Just quietly, by yourself, with a small brain trust, figure it out. So many people skip that step, it's kind of bewildering. That has to be step one. If you were Elon Musk, if you were Mark Zuckerberg, if you were the king of the world, what would you have happen? Write it down in vivid detail and figure out what that looks like. That has to be the first step.
I think, Chris, the more I've worked with startups, the more we've actually talked on this podcast, the more obsessed I am with this concept of a vision. If you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. Like so many of the conversations that you and I have with each other, but also with founders and startups we're working with, is you get this sense of confusion, right? The founder has an idea, they have kind of something, and then they get into business and they've got customers and they've got lots of people in their ears and they suddenly become a bit rudderless, right? They don't know where they're going. And that is when these corruptions really can happen easily, right? Because you will go for whatever business comes in. You will follow the leads. You will follow other things rather than
the regulator.
Follow the regulator. You'll follow the path of least resistance because you don't have a vision, right? If you don't know where you're going and you're walking along a path, right, you will follow the path. You won't follow the compass that says where it is that you're going. So the idea of a vision, that can sound a bit cheesy, but it's not. It's actually kind of at the absolute core. And if you don't like the term vision, you can call it a North Star or an ideal or something like that. But if you don't know what that is, and if you don't really believe in it somewhat obsessively, then it's going to be really hard, right? You kind of have to be obsessed with this thing. Otherwise, when things get tough, you're going to abandon it. And once you abandon it, it is very hard to find your way back. So it's like, yes, sit down with a bunch of people and so on, but this is not a cold academic exercise. This is a hot-blooded thing that you need to get in yourself as a founder or in yourselves as a founding group. And then you need to build it into the DNA of the company. This is what we are doing. If we can't do exactly this, we have to keep as close to it as possible. We have to make sure we don't close any doors that stop us from getting back to that vision, right? We can't abandon this thing because it is at the core of what we do. I actually think that if you don't get that right early, the rest becomes so much harder. And so if there's one thing you walk away from this episode, in my opinion, Chris, get this right, have a vision, then learn how to articulate it, and don't stop talking about it.
It's really important here, Yaniv, to define what we mean by vision, because people think they have to write down like the mission and vision statement of the company. And if they write that vision statement down, then like they're done. That's not what we mean by a vision, which is like mission, vision, strategy. Like what we mean is really quite a detailed understanding of like, this is a B2C company. It is designed for a hockey stick curve, and it's designed for venture backing, and it's designed for disrupting this ecosystem or this business or this legacy industry. And it's going to be 200 people by X thing, and we need this valuation. We need to do, like, it has to be quite detailed. And then the other thing is, it's not just the vision at that level. It's then the vision of what does this product look like in 12 or 24 months? And then it becomes, what does this screen look like? What does this fundraise look like? What does this decision today look like in the ideal? The vision is not just about the big things. You have to have a vision for every decision. You have to have an understanding at least of what is the ideal for this decision today, this project this week, this plan for this quarter, and for this business until it exits or blows up. And so it's not a one sentence vision. It is acting from a place of ideal or idealism at every decision, at every day. And then you mentioned a word that's very important. You need to believe in it. There are so many people who have visions who act like they don't believe in their own vision. They compromise. And they also don't seem to believe in the abundance of the world. It's like, well, there isn't a lot of capital around for this, Chris. And I'm like, there's probably billions and billions and billions of dollars for this problem in the world. Billions. And so you're talking about there's no capital down the street from your house, or there's no capital in your city, or there's no capital in your network. But let me assure you, there are billions of dollars lined up against this problem. People are spending billions of dollars to solve this problem one way or another. There is plenty of money. And so people just don't believe it.
Yep.
It really does come to belief there. And then the next topic here is that you need to have a bit of a healthy disrespect for authority and the status quo. And so, you and I, have talked about this idea of cultures and countries that have this kind of deferential relationship to authority. Australia has a little bit of that. It's a little bit of like, hey, if the government's doing it, there's probably a reason. If there's a law for that, it's probably a good law. Certainly authoritarian countries or countries that have come from communism or are still, flirting with that. The great leader is the one in charge, and you don't want to break norms. You don't want to break the hierarchy. And that's really hard. We used in the last episode this idea of, Amir brought this up, of people talk about the glass half empty and the glass half full. And people are sitting there trying to judge, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? The trick here is to say, who gives a shit how full the glass is? Go get some more water and top it up. And Amir rightly pointed out, and Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs, they don't kind of give a shit how full the glass is. They know that there is plenty of water in the world and in the universe. They'll go get some more.
You've often used this metaphor of being a space heater and not a thermometer. Now, in terms of glasses, it's like, stop debating how much water is in the glass or how to describe the quantity of water in the glass and figure out how to fill the damn thing. And then you don't have to have that debate. And
that's right.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. Like, you want to be disruptive. You can't be disruptive while having too much deference for authority in the status quo. It is nearly paradoxical or contradictory to believe that. So you need to think, okay, this is how things are, but it's probably not how things should be. Value creation and value capture, again, going back to your business, that you want to become valuable, comes from change, from doing things better than they are being done now. If you're not helping people do things better than they are now, well, guess what? You're not really in the business of building a venture-backed startup. So what is not good about the status quo, and how are you committed to helping to change that?
Now, I could imagine some skepticism from some people might be like, well, boys, you can't just live in a flight of fancy and you have to deal with reality and what have you, and you can't just be in magical land, right? No one here is saying that you can live in that ideal and disregard the reality. What we're saying is the first step is understanding what your vision for the ideal is. The very next step is engaging with that very difficult, very pragmatic reality to start bending it toward the ideal. And so that then takes tenacity and engagement with the details. It takes clear-eyed pragmatism, but not compromise. So you're taking small steps, judicious steps, real steps towards the ideal. And that's the entire point of this episode, which is you need to develop this graceful degradation hierarchy so that your compromises and your pragmatic engagement with reality are as minimal as possible, but there are compromises. So then the next piece of advice to having this kind of graceful degradation stack rank is writing it down. So you've written down and you've imagined vividly this ideal. and you believe in it, you've developed a real belief in yourself, in your ability to execute, and in the abundance in the world. And you've then developed this kind of clear-eyed pragmatism and tenacity, like, okay, you want to engage with the details of getting this done. The next step is simply just writing it down. Okay, if we don't get the ideal, what's the next step down? If we don't get that, what's the next step down? If we don't get that, what's the next step down? And it's even better if that stack rank is a roadmap. So we'll start from here, then we'll get the next thing, and then we'll get the next thing, and then we'll get the next thing. And lo and behold, we've made it as close to the ideal as humanly possible. The last bit of advice is, again, we've talked about have a vision, believe in it, have a healthy disrespect for the status quo, have an explicit graceful degradation plan, even if you just whip it up right there in the meeting as you're trying to figure out the decision. And the last thing is don't let your team and don't let yourself skip the stacked ranked graceful degradation plan. Don't let people go straight from, oh my God, the regulator won't let us, to, all right, let's not bother. Catch people doing that and force them to go back up to the top and work their way down one degradation, one option at a time through the list. It might seem obvious, but it'll be easy for people to slip, to skip steps in the chaos and panic and energy to solve the problem and move on.
You talked about a graceful degradation plan. I think one alternative that can work in a similar way is to have a list of non-negotiable principles. You know, we actually had Clementine on the show talking a little while ago about enterprise sales and how do you negotiate with enterprise sales and make sure you don't get thrown off your roadmap. And she had this document that basically says, these are the things we'll definitely do. These are the things we definitely won't do, right? It's sort of like a set of principles that they can take to their customers and have sales discussions around them. So I think when you're making decisions to say, like, are we sticking to these non-negotiable principles that keep us aligned with our vision is another way of doing this.
My first port of call is always to establish the business strategy and the product principles and what have you. But in my experience, the principles very quickly become academic and forgotten the moment they make contact with reality. You know, the principle might be, for example, let's continue to use well-regulated or highly regulated space as this example. By the way, guys, this is not just about regulation. It's about every decision you make, from UX to fundraising to regulation to everything, even hiring and staff quality and so on. But let's keep using regulation as the example. The principle might be, in a healthcare company, we want to build patient-centric products. But the moment the team encounters like a possible regulation, like, oh, you can't give that to the patient because the regulation says it must go through a general practitioner or a specialist, and the patient can't get their own data directly, they will immediately go, that's impossible. We cannot do that. But hang on a second, our principle is patient centricity. The patient deserves to have their own information. Let's noodle on that a little bit, but let's figure out what the graceful degradation is. Oh, no, that's not an area where we can be patient centric because the regulation says you're not allowed to do that. And again, my attitude in the meeting is going to be bullshit. I'm going to find a way to get that patient the data they need to get. Do I summarize it? Do I dilute it? Do I put a disclaimer about it? Do I ask them to agree to a terms of service before seeing it? Do I first get them to consult with the GP and then I encourage or force the GP to unlock it for the patient? Do I find a way to get that bloody test result into the patient's hand? And the answer is yes. One way or another, because that is the principle of the product. And so the principle making contact with reality, Yaniv, graceful degradation is the strategy by which the principle survives contact with reality. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so this is super important, right? If you're a founder and you are looking to stay true to your vision, but it can be hard with all the different voices in your ear, and you want someone to keep you on the straight and narrow and allow you to implement these graceful degradation plans within your business, Chris, I know this is the sort of thing that you love to do, so how can folks work with you?
Yeah, if it's not obvious, I'm very passionate about this stuff. So yeah, you can learn more about what I do and how I help over at chrissaad.com/advisory, and you can contact me there. Otherwise, you can also subscribe to my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter.
Fantastic. And you can find me mostly on LinkedIn, easy to find there, and on Twitter, sometimes known as X, @Bernstein, where I will sometimes post some sillier content.
All right, Nev, great to chat as always.
Likewise, Chris, have a good one.
Catch you later. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.